talking about something that's been going on for a very long time, but also which has impacted her and her university fairly dramatically over the past few months, which many of you know about, and which I suspect in the question and answer may come up a little bit. But I want to contextualize Jackie Stevens as a scholar before that. I've known her work for almost 2 decades, and it has always been a very interesting relationship of the imaginative and the practical. Jackie is somebody who has written on things as diverse as Hegel, methodology, immigrant rights and immigrant jails, published in a wide variety of locations, including op-eds in the New York Times, but also in the most theoretical political philosophy journals. And what she often does is a very interesting combination of this ability to imagine other possibilities, other worlds, and then looking very specifically at what the practical dynamics of those ideas would or could be. So, for example, one of her major theoretical contributions has been against the concept of birthright citizenship, against the idea that we are intrinsically tied to a nation state, and that that's the natural way in which things should be. Now, whereas some people might say, oh, that's an interesting late-night idea, Jackie will take that idea and really analyze not just what the problems are with the current nation-state system, but also what it would look like to get out of it. What would we have to do? What would we have to change? What institutions would we transform if we seriously and honestly wanted to contest them? But she's also practical in an everyday sense. Linked to this theoretical work, she has, as you can see, helped found and build the Deportation Research Clinic, which helps immigrants, many undocumented, continue their lives, to resist state action, to figure out what their legal rights are. This is not a sort of dry intellectual kind of theoretical work. It's also a very practical one. And I can mention that just today, as somebody was talking about this lecture on Facebook, some immigration lawyer from California posted underneath that announcement, I don't know Jackie Stevens, but she's done a huge amount. Thank her personally for it. So this is somebody with a reputation not just within academia, but a reputation among people who make it their life's work to protect the rights and lives of immigrants. Before I break her up here, though, I want to mention 2 things. One of 2 events. One, immediately after her talk and her question and answer, which we'll finish up in a little more than an hour, I'd like to invite everybody upstairs to the 9th floor, where we'll have a reception afterward in room 929. The second event, there's a flyer out there, a yellow flyer, for a forthcoming lecture on December 2nd by, again, a political philosopher named Tom Dunn, who will be talking about the relationship between Bartleby, neoliberalism, and the Great Refusal. So if you've ever wanted to see Melville and Marcuse discussed all at once, this will be your probably only chance. With that, I would like to welcome Jacqueline Stevens, Center for 21st Century Studies, and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
Thank you, Kennan, for that incredibly generous introduction and passing on the comment from somebody on Facebook. That's really nice to hear. This series seems really impressive. I want to come up in here, Tom. When Kennan was in touch with me and invited me to join in this conversation about saying no, I was, incredibly honored and very engaged by this topic. And I think it's a really important question to think about the different ways that we can say no. And there's, everything from questioning the legal authority of certain kinds of government actions to direct actions and so forth. And it's a really rich field to explore, and it's terrific that you're doing that. And I also want to thank Ali Sperling for helping out with the logistics and picking me up and making this all work so well. So this is the first presentation I'm giving on the research that got me banned. And what I'd like to do is focus on the substance of the work that I've been doing, but then also, of course, I'm very open to taking questions and talking about what actually happened, and there's a little bit of a timeline at the end of the talk. So there's also a bit of a caveat that there may be some glitches in this. Okay, so I want to talk about today's seeing like a citizen, and that's to engage James Scott's work, seeing like a state. What does it look like if we kind of open our eyes to the infrastructure failings of public spaces and governments, and in that context, think about the complementary causes for certain kinds of public impoverishment. And in my immediate world, that is the weaponized university. And what I'm going to focus on today is a little-known aspect of military trade that are called offsets. And these take the form of everything from grain sales that General Electric will make in exchange for a hospital in Brazil buying a generator, to scholarships at U.S. universities. And I'm going to be focusing on scholarships at U.S. universities and also the building of campuses in foreign countries in exchange for military sales and also siting bases. And then finally, I'll talk about why this research got me banned. Okay. Before I go forward, though, I want to read. I have two long passages I'm going to read to set this up. One is by Augustine, and the other is by Senator Fulbright. So this is from the Book of the City of God, which was written in 426. Justice being taken away, then, what are kingdoms but great robberies? For what are robberies themselves but little kingdoms? The band itself is made up of men. It is ruled by the authority of a prince. It is knit together by the pact of the confederacy. The booty is divided by the law agreed on. If by the admittance of abandoned men this evil increases to such a degree that it holds places, fixes abodes, takes possession of cities, and subdues peoples, it assumes the more plainly the name of a kingdom, because the reality is now manifestly conferred on it, not by the removal of covetousness, but by the addition of impunity. Indeed, that was an apt and true reply which was given to Alexander the Great by a pirate who had been seized. For when that king had asked the man what he meant by keeping hostile possession of the sea, he answered with bold pride, "What thou meanest by seizing the whole earth. But because I do it with a petty ship, I am called a robber, whilst thou who dost it with a great fleet art styled emperor." And this is, the context in which I, live in Chicago and also engage at Northwestern University and a board that regularly either breaks the law or changes it to suit its ambitions. Senator William Fulbright in 1968, and just to be clear, this guy on the left here in the photo is Henry Beenan, and he was the president of Northwestern University in the time frame in which the Doha campus was established, and he's also worked for the CIA, the State Department, Boeing, and currently consults with the Qatar Foundation and some other groups that we'll look at in a minute. And this is a meeting of him at the Chicago Board of Education, which is known for its corruption and malfeasance in the Chicago schools, and also for urging charter schools and other for-profit venues associated with the Pritzkers, who also are very active at Northwestern and elsewhere in Chicago. And this is what Fulbright, and the board of Northwestern, just to clarify, and I'll go back to this in a minute, is very much dominated by military interests. Fulbright in 1968 says, "Our country is becoming conditioned to permanent conflicts. More and more of our economy, our government, our universities are adapting themselves to the requirements of continuing war, limited war, and Cold War." He doesn't think that there's any conspiracy behind this, but rather it's done by groups that, he says it's done by a dense industry tied to armed forces by a national bond of common interests. And he says that universities might, this is a quote from Fulbright, they might have formed an effective counterweight to the military-industrial complex by strengthening their emphasis on the traditional values of our democracy. But many of our leading universities have instead joined the monolith, adding greatly to its power and influence, end quote. And I think we can see that at many universities. The example that I always notice is the emphasis on leadership programs and not citizenship programs, and that just seems like a big missed opportunity. So what, even though the talk's going to focus a lot on the granular level and the practices engaged with military sales associated with scholarships and education, it is worth thinking about the theoretical framework for engaging these questions. And one of the reasons that I have turned to what I call forensic intelligence is that the main theories that are very helpful and influential miss quite a bit when we're thinking about what goes wrong when the people are controlling certain venues of power, right? Because this is the Chicago Board of Education, and it's still all messed up, right? So, you could say, well, this is after the revolution, and there are people who are controlling certain kinds of public spaces, but it still doesn't work out right. And even people who are African American are still participating in and being affected by these kinds of practices. So there's certain kinds of kind of more mechanistic approaches to these questions that don't work. And Michel Foucault's theories of ordoliberalism and disciplinary as well as biopower also don't do justice to the state violence and kleptocracy that is going on. In some ways, they distract us from being able to see it. And there's, I'll just say very briefly that it is interesting to reflect on the fact that Foucault himself was very much integrated into the French state's Ministry of Culture, and that he worked through these different venues, through this venue in places like Hamburg and in Poland and in Tunisia, where he was an attaché of the French ministry. So as an alternative, and this is not really actually an alternative, but as a supplement to these other theories, I think about the work that I do as forensic intelligence, and I define this as what discovers, elicits, and produces knowledge of law and force with the ultimate objective of thwarting injustice. And I feel a little self-conscious coming up with this paradigm. It's more to make clear this idiosyncratic thing that I'm doing, and this is the definition. I don't expect anyone else is going to run out and do something like this, but this is how I understand what I'm up to. All right, so I want to spend a few minutes talking about some problems with Chicago, and I want to focus on the CTA. This was the stop near where I used to live in Edgewater. And the trains are falling apart. They don't run frequently enough, and so forth. When they get into the Howard station, I'm going to show you the map in a second. Instead of going into the north side, if one's continuing on to Evanston, they go into the south side, and then all of the old people and people who are disabled sort of have to climb up and go over to the right side of the tracks so that they can continue on their travels. I mean, it's really just an insult to the people who live there and who use that service. You can see on this map right here, let's see if I can point this out. You're not going to see it so well. So if you look at the middle of it is where so this is the stop that I used to get on, and it's about 6 miles between here and Davis, which is where the campus is. It takes between 45 minutes and an hour to get to go these 6 miles, and it's actually faster to either ride. It was actually to ride my bicycle, or which I couldn't do when it was really cold. Or what ended up happening to move to the area near the law school so I could take the campus shuttle. So it's faster to go from here to here than on the bus, just to go from here to here on CTA. Also, while I was there, they started doing these sting operations to try to catch people who were using, let's say, their mother's senior discount card to go on the trains. And I discovered this one day when there was a canine unit that was situated right in this area, but there were no dogs. So I asked them where the dogs were, and they said, oh, it's too cold for the dogs. But it turned out it was a sting operation, and that when people were going in and using the senior citizen discount cards, they were thinking, well, I don't have any drugs on me, I'm just going to go to school, and they were getting arrested. And these are actual, mugshots from people who were arrested for this misdemeanor of, giving away. This is giving away a transfer card. It's a $100, at least $100 fine for this. They were held in prison. And this is in contrast with an expense report that was submitted by a Northwestern administrator for, $2,000 to fly to the Outback Bowl. And it is classified as graduation receptions in January. So I don't know if that is true or not, if there were any off-season graduation receptions. But, just the disparity in, how money gets spent and the punishments for different kinds of transgressions. There's no way that anybody would do more than say, oh yeah, he probably did have to go to this and just let it go, as opposed to somebody who might have a really good reason for wanting to go to school and couldn't afford the transit fare. It's $3 million that the police claimed were lost through these, the use of the cards. And, if you think about the cost of the law enforcement and the cost of lacking transportation, the jobs, the work that's missed and so forth, the time it costs to hold people in jail for a $2.25 fare, it doesn't make any sense at all. Another example of Chicago falling apart in the public sector is the Chicago State University, which is really on life support right now. And it seems like, Rauner and other Republicans in the Capitol are continuing to try to shut down public institutions. Meanwhile, Chicago has the highest sales tax in the country at 10.25%. And also extremely high those are the property taxes, and also extremely high sales taxes and property taxes. So nothing works. The state has no money, and we have extremely high taxes. Meanwhile, this is from a complaint in 1969 against Northwestern University because it had been using its tax exemption to buy land from Pepsi-Cola and from Nabisco, and then make developments on the land to improve the land, then rent the land back to these sites with the buildings on them, back to Nabisco and Pepsi, so that they wouldn't have to pay property taxes. And so the money, some of it is going from Nabisco and Pepsi. Instead of going into Chicago, in Cook County, it's going into Northwestern's coffers, or they're just paying a little bit less. And you can just see here that, this is a summary from the complaint by this guy who's going through the tax rules, and he was trying to find places where he could make tax liens for people who weren't paying their taxes. And he saw all these industrial spaces that were exempt and couldn't figure out why, and he became, got this bee in his bonnet about it, and in 1969 filed a lawsuit, which, by the way, was joined by Cook County, which affirmed all of the statements that I just made. So he made these statements in his complaint, and Cook County affirmed them. This is kind of setting up what I want to talk about as what I see as the real Chirac, and that has to do with people through Northwestern in particular, making super profits and then extracting them from the public economy and using them to either pour back into their own private wealth or to enhance these private institutions. Northwestern has an endowment now of about $12 billion. It has an operating budget of about $2.3 billion a year. And that's, it's a significant chunk of money. About a third of the money is coming from the government that is funding Northwestern. And so it's worth, thinking about how this money is being distributed and the lack of any kind of transparency or accountability over it. One of the main families that is, its name is literally all over the campus, is the Crown family. There's the Rebecca Crown Plaza, the Henry Crown Pavilion, and the family has been very involved in Northwestern since the 1960s. They make their money from General Dynamics. Lester Crown, who's still on the board, inherited General Dynamics Wealth and Control. The Crown family, as you saw, is the 35th wealthiest in the country. Stephen Crown is his son. He's on the General Dynamics. He's a General Dynamics director. These are all people who are Northwestern trustees right now. Phoebe Novakovic is General Dynamics CEO and chair, and she's also a director at Abbott Laboratories, which has a number of directors on Northwestern's board as well. James McInerney is a Boeing chair and president. Sorry, this isn't the most recent version. Well, Condit was the Boeing CEO until 2005, and McInerney was until 2016. And so you could see there's these interlocking directorates that are, helping out or connected to the military. This is an article from 1970 when somebody turned down an honorary, received a first prize, turned down an honorary degree from Northwestern, and the grounds for this was that Northwestern was involved with the military. What was so interesting about his reason for turning it down is that he couldn't point to anything in particular about Northwestern. He just said, well, Northwestern's a really big university. Most really big universities are involved with the military, so I'm not even going to come because it must be the case that your hands are dirty. And it turns out he was right. He didn't have the particular details, but this is what was going on in the 1970s. This is an image of the Lajes Air Base off of the west coast of Portugal. And it's part of this is one of the earliest examples I have, documentation of this offset trade using educational scholarships. These kinds of offsets where there's a favor that the U.S. does or a U.S. company does for the foreign government that's either purchasing military goods or allowing a base to be sited goes back to Eisenhower when he incentivized West Germany to allow the U.S. air base in exchange for a whole bunch of different things, including educational opportunities. The Azori Island Base Agreement was a renewal of a 1954 base agreement with the fascist Portuguese government in which the United States committed to build a campus there and also to enroll students from Portugal in teaching programs in the United States. The first program was, they rolled this out at Columbia Teachers College in 1972, and then University of Texas and Northwestern joined the program in 1973. This was arranged at the cabinet level by the Secretary of State, and it was completely secret. The administrators and the students who participated in this had no idea that their education was part of this deal to renew the Azori Island base for the United States. This is how it was described in a 1972 cable, quote, Texas and Northwestern willing to send their reps to Portugal at the same time as teaching college if Crespo, who's the Minister of Education, feels smoke screen thick enough. Another excerpt says, the parties agree the so-called Easter Conference would be the smokescreen to mask evaluation and selection of the candidates, end quote. In 1970, so they had these students who were invited, many of them who were already teachers, to this conference, and then the administrators from Northwestern and so forth would mingle with them and they figure out if they wanted them to be admitted. But nobody knew what the context was for the United States paying for this. In 1973, Texas received $250,000 to take in 11 students. Northwestern received $279,000 for 8 students. There's a line in one of the cables that says, quote, apparently the best qualified students are going to Northwestern, end quote. In 1976, the State Department wanted to pull out of the program because they felt that it was too confusing for them to pursue it and to turn it over to the Fulbright Commission. And they had $200,000 remaining in the balance. And I think one of the reasons that Fulbright is so engaged in this question about the militarization of the academy is that he was aware of the use of these Fulbrights, and he couldn't talk about it publicly, but he was upset by the agreements more generally, and so he attacked the universities for participating, not in the stuff that they didn't know about, but in the programs of which they were aware. So what is the Bluff airfield? So why was it important to the United States? It was a key hub for operations in Africa and the Middle East, and it actually was the only base that was available to the United States in 1973 in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, when the United States wanted to support Israel. There's a quote that says that the U.S. allies in Europe, fearful of losing oil supplies, denied U.S. landing rights for the operation. Only Portugal agreed to cooperate fully with the airlift, giving U.S. landing rights at Lajes Field. In addition, the reason they wanted to keep this clandestine was that it was a way for the United States to support and coordinate as well with Portuguese militias in Africa that were organizing against communist party operations and guerrillas. There's a cable that says, that extols the importance of the program and says, quote, the project would be totally unrelated to the Portuguese role in Africa. Meaning that nobody would be able to connect the dots between the education funding and the support and organization with the operations in Africa. There's the Secretary of Defense Carlucci at the time writes, quote, the building of the Azore University is evidence of the government of Portugal's good faith toward the Azores. The university helps validate the government, that's end quote. And then my comment on this is that the university is helping to validate the government of Portugal in this area where the people are seeking independence from Portugal, and it helps try to absorb dissent from this vibrant separatist movement at the time. Also during this time frame, Henry Kissinger was in touch with various administrators at Northwestern University to arrange for scholarships that would evade the prohibition of government funding, training national intelligence and security forces in the United States. And so he sends these cables saying, can you please take care of these Saudi nationals on a reimbursable basis, suggesting that Northwestern will take care of the payments, and then the State Department will pay Northwestern rather than paying the Saudis directly. Okay, so that's, the description I just gave you of this kind of program will appear as well when we talk about the Qatar base that was part of the offset trade for Northwestern. But before I go into that, I want to talk about the way that private offset arrangements work as well. So there's something called military offsets, and this is a report from 1996 where it says offset demand continues to grow. And what this is in exchange for winning a contract from a government, the United States supplier will, or let me special, in order to incentivize a contract with a foreign government, the United States has various kinds of incentives that it can offer to these governments that aren't just about price and aren't just about the weapon systems. And one of the things that they can offer are technology transfers, training, for how to use the weapons and so forth. But they can also offer scholarships, or they can offer to build universities in that country. 50 to 100% of contracts right now have these kinds of offset arrangements. And what that means is that, okay, so this is actually from a government slide. And so it's saying that it could be something, it's not transparent, right? So it's like how many hams are going to be worth, how many like outlets for distributing ham, or for producing ham, or for giving people ham curing technology would be, would be in exchange for procuring contract. Like it's not transparent, and there's a big range in how these things get monetized. But what would happen is, let's say that you're going to say, okay, I'm going to give you $10 million for a plane, and $5 million in offsets for distributing our hams. Then it would be valued at 50% of the contract. That's what that means. This is an article in the Economist saying that more governments are insisting that weapons sellers invest in these side deals to help them develop their industries, and explains why it's bad because it's not transparent. The United States policy on this is officially against it, and because in part it appears to violate the Foreign Corruption Reporting Act. Nonetheless, in practice they allow it, and this is from a government slide that is giving an example of how these offsets work. And these are, you can see that company A is trying to sell the fighter aircrafts and the guided missiles, and it's worth $500 million. And then country A wants to get support for its natural gas drilling and its natural gas distribution. And so they're saying, oh, okay, if you help us out with that, we're going to say, well, your help with that is worth about $150 million, and that'll be part of our exchange. The person who claims to have invented this is associated with the firm called Blenheim Capital, and he says, this is a quote from their website, "So-called offsets are a determining factor in the signature of major contractors, particularly in the defense sector. From being a sideline, they have become a central feature in contract negotiations. One of the reasons for their success is that they are not totally covered by transparency criteria governing commission payments," end quote. So it's like basically saying it might be a little easier to bribe people if you're able to use these kinds of arrangements. According to the U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security, which is the agency that oversees defense contractor reporting, the U.S. government, quote, "prohibits any agency of the U.S. government from encouraging, entering directly into, or committing U.S. firms to any offset arrangement for sale of defense articles." But the report notes this is a quote, "several U.S. defense contractors have informed BIS that offsets are usually necessary in order to make defense sales, and that in 2012, military contractors entered into 43 reported offset agreements worth $10.1 billion, which were 40% of the total reported contract sales," end quote. So these contract sales, we don't know if all of them are being reported. It seems like this number is actually under-reporting them. And it's also the case that they're only required to report any sales of any offset arrangements that are $5 million or more. An example of a successful military offset Blenheim Capital describes is the development of the Qatar Science and Technology Park inside Education City in partnership with the Qatar Foundation, and he boasts of bringing together more than 30 aerospace, defense, and high technology companies from the Qatar Supply Network working in partnership with Education City in Doha. So this is where Northwestern comes in. One of the challenges that the thorn in the sides of the United States government for years had been Al Jazeera. There's a congressional report where they lament in 2003 the negative coverage by Al Jazeera of U.S. operations in the Middle East, and consider various kinds of policies, either to create an alternative network, to tie foreign aid to media reform, to buy commercial time on Arabic television, to have U.S. officials engage Al Jazeera directly, to appear in more interviews, or to encourage more privatization of the media. None of this really happens, and so even in 2005, there's more concerns about Al Jazeera. If there's a single thing that embodies the differences between Saudi and Qatar is the continued existence of the Al Jazeera satellite television channel. Okay, so this is now from Henry Beenan, who's the president of Northwestern. This is his list of affiliations, and you can see at the bottom that he is a senior advisor to Her Highness Sheikh Moza of Qatar. And he's also, involved with, this one doesn't have, he's also, oh right, the first one says he's on the board of directors of the Qatar Foundation Advisory Board. There's a State Department cable in 2008 that talks very explicitly about using Northwestern to engage Al Jazeera. More polling data are needed to evaluate better whether our use of Al Jazeera and other Arabic language media is having the desired impact. We need to increase our polling. In the longer run, Northwestern University School of Journalism campus in Qatar can act as a resource and help professionalize Al Jazeera's staff. We will devote time and resources to help Northwestern establish a strong and lasting working relationship with Al Jazeera. And then flash forward 2013, there's a memorandum of understanding between Northwestern University and Al Jazeera. And the channel and the website have changed their coverage, at least the English language coverage, quite considerably, and really backed off of the anti-US focus. In addition, the Northwestern campus is making good on the media polling that the State Department mentioned, and they've been producing these surveys that seem really inconsistent with reality. So one of the surveys of the public's response to the media suggests that there's a huge amount of trust among the participants in the survey in 6 countries in the Middle East, including in Egypt and Qatar, and like places where they're jailing and torturing journalists. When on the website it has a methods section, and it's very vague, and it says if you have more questions about the methods to write. So I wrote, and then they wrote back and said, see our methods section. I said, but the methods section says, oh, if you have more questions, write. And they took that off the website. Okay. This is another example of, it's the same guy, Grant Rogan, who is the guy at Blenheim Capital, and he's also, and so he's talking about his work through Blenheim Capital, helping Saudi Arabia arrange for Georgia Tech to be established there. And then if you look over on the left-hand side here, this is the King Abdullah Scholarship Program, which started in 2005 with an agreement between King Abdullah and President George Bush to increase the number of Saudi students in the U.S. And this appears to be in response to the 2003-2004 sighting of 10,000 U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia for use in the Iraq Gulf War. Here are some numbers on the amounts that have been spent that are reported. So this is total education offsets for military trade as reported to the U.S. government, to the Bureau of Industry and Security. And they break it down by, it's not, so you still have to kind of eyeball the differences. I don't have a huge amount of confidence in the accuracy of these numbers. They stopped reporting them after 2006. I have some FOIA requests into the BIS to try to get more specific information about it. And then this is just the numbers for universities. So this is like all education. So if there's an elementary school set up or something, that would be counted here. And then this is the amount for U.S. universities. So this is a list of the companies and the amount of business that they do. And I'm out of time, so I want to just get to this slide here. So if you look at this is a list of the top 25 places of origin for international students studying in the United States. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is how it roughly, relates, not exactly in a specific rank order, but roughly maps out more than you'd expect by population size onto the military sales from the United States to these countries. And it helps, if you look at the number 4 and 5, right? 3 and 4, South Korea and Saudi Arabia should not, by virtue of their populations, be occupying the 3rd and 4th most frequent, the highest number of students in the United States. And what that does, and the same thing with Vietnam at number 9, and actually Taiwan and Japan as well. And so what you can see is that there's some kind of, this is Japan, so Taiwan and Vietnam. So there does seem to be some kind of, loose correlation between the weapons sales and the participation in U.S. Programs. The GAO has been, trying to follow up on this program and issued a set of guidelines asking for more transparency. In response, these guys moved in the opposite direction. And so they're saying, I'll just give you one example. The amended regulation removes transaction references to activities commonly not reported to BIS, barter, counter-trade, counter-purchase, and buyback, and instead they call this licensed production, investment, training, and purposes. So you have no idea then what the nature of these arrangements are. Okay, I'm going to just wrap up right now, and let's see. Yeah. But by suggesting that, so two things. If you want to look up more details about this, the place to look are the annual reports of the Bureau of Industry and Security, and those are online, and so you can find, the offset information that I've shared here. A lot of to really drill down into it would require filing FOIA requests. Okay. So then, here's what happened. Here's why I got banned. When I was doing the reporting for the research on this, I was making inquiries into Lester Crown and Crown Endowed chairs. And one of the things that I learned was that when Dan Linzer was the dean at Weinberg, there had been a suggestion made that the sociology department wanted to hire a particular individual, and Linzer, as dean, went back to the department and said that he couldn't do that because he couldn't look his friend in the eye at football games if they went ahead with this appointment because of the candidate's politics on Palestine. So I was checking into that, and I was emailing the provost, and I also, slightly later, was making inquiries into Northwestern's charter and also the Qatar campus, because I couldn't figure out, why does Northwestern have a campus in Qatar? That just made no sense to me. Then in 2015, September 2015, last fall, I published this article in Perspectives on Politics, Forensic Intelligence, and the Deportation Research Clinic Toward a New Paradigm, and some of the information that I'm sharing with you today was in that article. And what happened is in October 2000, and I also began inquiries into this initial information that a retired lieutenant general and former ambassador to Afghanistan with no PhD and no scholarly publications was slated to direct the Buffett Institute for Global Studies, of which the Deportation Research Clinic is a part. And I started asking my colleagues in the Buffett Institute if that was okay with them, how they felt about it. And when it seemed like enough people were disturbed by this possibility, a group of us approached the search committee and then the provost and the president to push back. Ultimately, after an extended period of campus debate that eventually was covered by the national media, he withdrew from this position. And there was a lot of resentment against me for this on the part of the board and the administration. Anyway, also in October 2015, the chair canceled the department election for the faculty senate after I indicated I wanted to run, and instead prevailed on somebody who was on leave in France to continue in that position. So, and I know from her letter that I've since read that was to the dean of faculty, documenting that she wanted me out of the department by fall 2016, that she had been working with the provost's office on trying to remove me from the department with the provost's office since the beginning of the academic year of 2015. So, I'll end there. Can I call him forward?
Thank you so much. I want to make sure that I understand how the current offsets are working with the university, because you said in the 70s that Northwestern and Texas had no idea necessarily what they were involved in. And then you gave the example from the government slide about offsets where it was Company A wanted to sell to country A, and country A wanted something that company A already made, right? So how does Northwestern get involved now in the offsets, and do they totally know that
Right.
they're involved?
Right, so I think different people know different things. And I think let's see, I'm just trying to, right. So you heard me say that officially the United States government's not supposed to be involved in any of this offset trade. But there's an industry insider writes, quote, "The important point for a purchaser to understand is that offset agreements can occur in conjunction with foreign military sales." That's the government sales. "It has been a misconception that offsets are only compatible with direct commercial sales procurements," end quote. And so what this suggests to me is that, and I'm going back to the slide here about the Blenheim Capital and Doha in Education City. Sorry. Anyway, so Blenheim Capital is making these arrangements with Boeing, with General Dynamics. I mean, there's 30 aerospace military corporations that are involved in funding Education City. And so, you know, I can't prove that there's a direct memorandum between Boeing and the Qatar government that says, okay, well, we're going to make sure that Northwestern puts a campus here. So I'm just inferring from the fact that this is the stuff right there, that there are these individuals such as Henry Beenan and the companies that I mentioned that are overtly active. We know Boeing's active in the Qatar Foundation and Education City. That has a relationship to Northwestern's campus being there, especially in the context of the State Department saying, oh, we want to, you know, have Northwestern there to change the coverage of Al Jazeera. So, you know, there's a conjunction of these elites, and it's not like they're, you know, doing this stuff without knowing each other and what their agendas are. Being able to exactly, you know, quote somebody saying that is something I can't do yet. We'll see.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to make some points that may seem rather simple, but perhaps you could develop them in the future. One was the way in which you are bringing out a sort of conflation between what in other sort of analytical circles might call sort of soft power and hard power. And that's sort of what's fascinating is that generally this kind of perception of the waning of American power, except as a military power, and then in the field of higher education. And so the fact that these are kind of converging is a really kind of fascinating correlation. But I would probably caution in terms of some of the correlations regarding, and we could talk later about South Korea because it's just so complex, and there are many military connections, but I think its overrepresentation in education is just, there's so much there. And part of it is also linked, of course, to kind of this presence of U.S. military presence in South Korea and a kind of positioning, a subject position as anti-communist by studying abroad in the U.S. So it's not this, so in any case, one of the other correlations that might be, I would recommend considering is the TPP, particularly a peace activist and journalist, Kuhan Peck, who's based in Hawaii, has written about the remarkable expansion of bilateral military exercises and how the countries that were included in the TPP deal are also, and that of course creates markets for arms, and whether there is a connection with offsets might be, so in terms of another transnational structure for investigating some of that kind of collusion. And just the other thing that came to mind during your talk really was the revelations about going back to the 50s, basically the funding of much of the American avant-garde and abstract expressionism by the CIA, and really this kind of the other maybe overly simplistic conflation of sort of cultural capital and sort of hard capital in terms of being able to use the prestige or also to give a veneer, a more polished veneer to sort of American power through the kind of sublimating through kind of these networks of American educational, expanding those. And often I agree that these are divorced from you don't necessarily overlay them with its military alliances, although I think from just standpoint abroad, that is almost more implied. It's actually clearer to see from abroad than from the U.S. I would, from my own kind of perception.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say one quick thing that I didn't go into in the talk, and it is about the kind of path dependence of using certain kinds of weapon systems to create alliances between different governments, right? And one of the reasons that the United States kind of looks the other way when defense contractors are doing this offset trade is that the United States wants everybody to be using U.S. weapons because it creates what they call interoperability dependencies. So once you get the U.S. systems, it's kind of like the coffee pods, whatever, right? Like you have to keep going back because if you want to get the machines updated, if you want to get the right ballistics and so forth, then you need to go to the same supplier. And it also creates dependencies within the military, so that you have to have U.S. training, you have to be kind of tied into the United States. It is very paradoxical. On the one hand, the United States is doing this because they want this kind of engagements, but on the other hand, they're also giving weapons to organizations and to governments that have agendas radically opposed to their own. So these State Department memos point out that a portion of the Hamas leadership is happily residing in Qatar. That the Qatar government has what the United States says, either a confused foreign policy or one that the United States does not understand. Because on the one hand, it's very friendly to the United States. It doesn't even charge them for the base. And then on the other hand, they're supporting Islamicist troops that are, like hard radical Islamicists, so to speak, in Libya. And so it really starts to look as though the United States as a government, but also just as these elites, wants to be in the mix. And what these weapon sales allow them to do is to be at the table, which is also one of the positions that Hillary Clinton has put forward for wanting to intervene in different countries in Syria and so forth.
I think the Qatari point might be, explained in part by the United States' interest in seeing the gas pipeline, which would run through Syria to Europe, as opposed to the alternative one proposed by Iran. So that's when things, of course, start getting messy, and we all of a sudden start finding radical Islamic groups that we then rebrand as moderates when it's convenient. And of course, we've seen this before, and of course, we're seeing it ongoing now.
Yeah, Northwestern is actually training Qatari police to help with the road construction for the pipeline. Yeah, but that's a good point.
Okay, so there's a lot to absorb here, and pardon my ignorance, I'm an engineer, not a poli-sci person. But, so obviously there's immediate impact on your academic freedom and perhaps academic freedom at large. There's also the idea that, okay, dealing with companies and corporations, no matter your political leaning, just humanist idea that devices that kill people are bad and they're, icky business. So other than those obvious factors, what are the implications to higher education, to specifically public institutions of higher education, and really to the population at large, there would be a cynical point of view that would say, okay, yes, so what? I mean, the government's corrupt, we know that. What does it all mean to us?
Right. I mean, that's why I began with the quotations from Augustine and from Fulbright, because I do think that there are these, it's not just that there are these bad things that are happening, but there are opportunity costs that we're paying by having, our educational agendas framed by the priorities of a certain kind of, national security paradigm and by the, budgeting priorities of the, the nation state. And that there are these, that there are certain, like if you are invested in selling weapon systems because of interoperability engagements that allow you to have your, have a place at the table around the world, that's a really different way of thinking about civic culture, citizenship, democracy, globalization, than if you, have a whole range of possibilities for how you might want to think about borders and to think about conflict and so forth. And so one of the challenges, and I have to apologize because this isn't I wish this were a little bit more organized than that it's been, because it's my first time doing this. It's my, whatever. But it is complicated. I mean, there is a lot going on, and there is a lot that's unknown. There's something that's also just fundamentally disturbing about a university keeping secrets, right? Like there's something really that is wrong about that. And so, this is just an effort to kind of, throw out some information and start a conversation and think about what the new places are to look for answers and for ways of framing this and so forth. So I guess that's the best I can do right now.
And I had just another follow-up question, since we're at Public University in Wisconsin, and so just really maybe your thoughts or to reflect on the response to the defunding of public higher education.
Right. I mean,
and so part of that strategy throughout the country has really been by bringing in more international students, particularly from China. And so there is this presence, I mean, it's in institutionalized to a sense where they'll have dormitories constructed in American cities. And so on the one hand, you have this influx of, sort of Chinese international students, but then on the other hand, you have the major shift in American military policies, the pivot to Asia, right, where there's a, depending on the analysis, it's a kind of encirclement or a countering of the rise of China. So it just seems that both of these things are happening at once, and I just wondered if you had, had a chance to.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's why, yes, I have thought about this. Illinois has the largest number of foreign students of any state in the country. And it's a really good example of what you're talking about with the students from China. University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana is one of those places that, right, that has these special programs and dorms and so forth. Crown, by the way, is a very active trustee at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. I mean, I don't know if that's exactly the reason, but it's kind of an interesting correlation there. Yeah. So the thing to think about is what it means for. I mean, you guys have to think about this a lot. For our public institutions to be defunded while these nonprofits are avoiding paying taxes. I mean, Northwestern has a $150 million brand new, gleaming, gorgeous building that's built on the shores of Lake Michigan with Illinois bond money, and there's a whole range of projects that are being pursued in private institutions with bond money or with Illinois retirement funds or with other kinds of pots of public money. And so one thing that this is an incentive to do is for us to pay a lot more attention to this kind of like wonky stuff about when you see all these bonds and lots of zeros and so forth, who's actually controlling that? And what does it mean that this money is being used to recirculate through hedge funds and go to invest in private airlines in Afghanistan to buy airplanes from Boeing. And how much of that money is going through our nonprofit foundations and our nonprofit universities and so forth, so that these kinds of funds are not being subject to public control. And so even when it's state money, right? And so I guess that's the connection that I would make, is that there is a really, that's why I started off with the slides about how Chicago's falling apart, right? Because to me, there's a really direct connection between the, again, like siphoning this money out of the public and distributing it to elites both in the United States or to make foreign sales. The Boeing example is not a random one. Like, there really is just a huge focus in the State Department on trying to figure out how to get private loans to emerging or private or state airlines in developing countries so that they can buy Boeing airplanes. In addition to the in addition to the military planes, but just also selling commercial planes. So, this kind of prioritization of circulating capital so people can skim some money off of the top is a real problem, and it creates a perverse set of incentives that have the consequences that we're seeing right now.
And just as a follow-up, I think that also your this whole ordeal with the banning, I think it shows another kind of political technology of how dissent is being contained, of course, right? And Kennan mentioned to the fellows earlier about how this was the third such case in the last 2 years. And so that, but to me, from the perspective of working in a public university, it seems that dissent is being contained in a sense through austerity. I think of sort of David Graeber's work on bureaucracy, right, and these kind of other strategies. Whereas for a private university that's well endowed and has these measures in place, that there's other strategies they need to form in order to counter. So just the courage that you're continuing this research. I want to thank you so much, because it's really illuminating. But that's just that, and the response in terms of kind of the dissenting scholarship to see these developments is really quite chilling. It's sobering.
Yes, I can hear you.
It's loud. We're recording it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead and record me while I throw my department under the bus. Not really my department, but my area under the bus. So I'm not a political science person. I come from the world of psychology, and for anyone who is paying attention, the APA got itself in a little bit of a mess with the military and terrorism, particularly like the higher structure. Now, of course, APA is not all psychologists, but unfortunately their higher structure is sort of what everyone goes to when they see psychology. And it seems that it may have started off fairly innocently, quotation marks, and had sort of then become further and further embroiled. When you read that, is that something that you could foresee for this sort of thing, that because of the financial incentives and the people in power, this is something that could actually, this sort of situation can continue to develop into something that's even wandering even more from just ethically icky, questionable, problematic into even worse territory, that the universities could then find themselves with the same giant black eye that APA gets to walk around with for a while.
I think that could easily happen with the DARPA and the Minerva projects that are being run through universities. So yeah, going back to this question about, which also are also in place at public universities. Imagine if our boards were people more like us, right? Like, what would we set as our priorities for where we would want campuses, for what the new kinds of programs would be, for how we want to, engage departments and disciplines? Would we have leadership training conferences in Florida? Would we have, gorgeous new, brand new, shiny buildings for the business school? Would we have IT support who are undergraduates for the humanities and, engineer PhD support for the business school, right? So if you think about like all of the ways that we are being forced to accommodate ourselves to these institutional priorities that are associated with agendas that really have nothing or very little, obviously, to do with higher education. It really is important for us to think about how we can rearrange that, because the more we capitulate to this or just go along, the less we're able to ask these kinds of critical questions. And it has to do with everything from the curriculum to the percentage of our faculty who are temporary or instructors, to the time it takes that there's this new, like, you have to finish your degree in 5 years or you're out, even if you can get other funding on campus kind of stuff. Well, that's a kind of de-skilling of academia. And it makes it less and less likely that people are going to be able to develop the critical tools and the knowledge in order to put themselves in a position to stand up to the people who are doing this. So, I think this travels across institutions and disciplines.
Time for one more question.
One question, and we know it is difficult in America to forbid a person own firearm weapon. Should we change our thinking, forbidding the bullet, such as we made bullet from elastic rubber? Such, how to say?
Should we have rubber bullets? Is it?
I mean, change your thinking to forbidden bullet. So, made bullet from such as rubber, elastic.
Should we have elastic bullets?
Yeah. Elastic bullet.
I haven't really thought that.
That's it is
Why are you asking that question?
harmless to people.
You mean so that if they're, like, for weapons that are being sold for wars, or for any weapon?
Personal can use their gun, shoot somebody.
Sure.
So we can forbidden the.
I think they should be
bullet.
filled with Lucky Charms. I think there's one more question back there.
That we don't like manufacture metal bullets, we just manufacture rubber bullets.
Right. I understood that, I think.
Anyone else?
I was just suggesting that we manufacture bullets made of, yeah.
Well, I would like to thank everyone for coming, invite you upstairs to the 9th floor, and thank our guest, Jacqueline Stevens.